What is the best brand of yeast for bread production? By Ariana Cooper. Considering the average American eats 53 pounds of bread yearly, bread is in consistent demand, making it incredibly profitable, especially among larger companies, bringing in a total revenue of $497.5 billion globally as of 2022. So I wanted to know which brand of yeast was the most effective for producing high quality bread for its consumers while keeping costs low for producers. Active dry yeast is a portable granulated form of baker's yeast. It is made up of dehydrated unicellular organisms that feed off sugar and starch. It produces carbon dioxide and alcohol. As a result, the carbon dioxide then gets trapped in the structure that is formed by gluten strands during the baking process, helping the bread rise and boost flavors, making it the best option for baking goods. Bob's Red Mill claims to be the best because of its nutritional factors and because it's good for people who have trouble digesting yeasted or fermented foods. Fleischmann's claims to be the best because of its rich history and rich flavor. Fleischmann's is one of the top brands when it comes to baked goods and was America's first commercially produced yeast. Meyer's brand was the cheapest, being only $1.25, and was the most readily available for the average person. For this experiment, the researcher used Christian Lee Smith's homemade bread recipe, Gold all-purpose flour, Domino's granulated sugar, kosher salt, Fleischmann's, Bob Red Mills, and Meyer's brand active dry yeast. Smith's recipe was chosen because it was the easiest to follow and was highly rated among users. These ingredients were picked because they're the easiest to find in stores and are relatively inexpensive. To begin the experiment, I put a teaspoon of sugar and dry active yeast and 1/4 cup into a stand mixer, having it mix for 5 minutes before adding in 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt and trading the whisk for a mixer hook. Slowly adding in 2.5 cups of flour to the bowl, making sure the mixer was on low. Once it finished mixing, flour was sprinkled into a separate bowl. Flour was sprinkled into a separate bowl and on the dough before it was moved into it, where it was then covered with a damp towel and was left to rise for 1 hour. Once the hour was up, the dough was moved to a cutting board that was sprinkled with flour and shaped into a circle. Afterwards, it was carefully moved back into a bowl for another 30 minutes to finish rising. While the bread had finished rising, the oven was preheated to 460 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Dutch oven was placed inside with the lid on for 30 minutes. When the half an hour was up, the Dutch oven was removed from the oven, sprinkled with flour, and the dough was put inside. Before putting the lid back on the Dutch oven and returning it to the oven for another 30 minutes. Once the 30 minutes were up, the lid was removed and it was placed back into the oven for 15 more minutes. Finally, after 15 minutes was completed, it was removed from the oven and left to cool. Once it was cooled, I took measurements of the bread's height and diameter and tasted the bread. These steps were repeated exactly the same for every yeast used. Bob's Red Mill rose to a height of 3.5 inches and 8 inches in diameter. Its dough was the easiest to work with. It was firm but soft and smooth, and it held its shape perfectly. The bread itself was a bit more on the solid and heavy side, but it didn't crumble and was soft enough to cut nicely. The flavor was fine. It tasted like slightly stale white bread. Fleischmann's yeast rose to 3 inches in height and 7.5 inches in diameter. Its dough was a bit harder to work with, being much softer and moist, but it held its shape just fine. Fleischmann's bread was soft, light, and tasted overall the best. Meyer's yeast was the overall worst of the three. It rose to a height of 2.7 inches and a diameter of 7.3 inches. It was very hard, almost like stale bread, making it incredibly difficult to cut and very crumbly. Its dough was incredibly sticky and wet, making it nearly impossible to work with, and it didn't hold its shape well at all. Overall, Fleischmann's active dry yeast produced the best results. While Bob's Red Mill had the largest increase in size, Fleischmann's was right behind it. It tasted the best and had the best texture. Meyer's yeast was the worst, tasting almost inedible and being the hardest to work with. So the results were as expected. Fleischmann's yeast had an overwhelming amount of positive reviews and the most recommended. There were no studies found like this. However, based on what was learned when researching, different brands of Fleischmann's and Bob's Red Mill were highly recommended and had similar results to what their websites had described.